WestJet Pilots and other podcast listeners, and welcome to this edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilots podcast. I'm Captain Desmond Jordan. I'll be your host today, joined as always by the Wizard of Sound, Captain Chris Von Jones, here in the sound booth. And today we have a very special guest, Captain John Jaenicke, Toronto-based 737 captain, and our scheduling committee chair. John, how are you doing today?
Good, Des. It's great to finally actually make it out. I've been trying to make it out for the last few months, and it's finally great to be here in Calgary.
Happy to have you here, and I'm sure our pilots are going to be very interested in what you have to say. So as I had mentioned, you're the chair of the scheduling committee. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of background about who you are, who else is with you on the scheduling committee, and how long you've been doing that.
Yeah, so I've been on the scheduling committee since we've been with ALPA, and then previous to that, I was scheduling. I had some experience with the WGPA and scheduling as well. So the scheduling committee now, we've kind of grown the committee.
Who are the members of that committee?
Yeah, so there's myself, Mike Matika, out in Vancouver there, Mike Mills out in Toronto. We have Eric Van Gerwen, captain in Toronto, Alan Ross, captain in Calgary there, Stephen Delph, a captain in Vancouver, Barry Murphy, captain in Toronto, and their newest member is Kurt Reimer, who's going to be joining us, captain out in Vancouver as well. We have now two subcommittees. We have a pairing construction committee and a PBS committee. So PBS is preferential bidding system.
So, John, could you tell us a bit more about the SRC, or the Scheduling Review Committee, Pairing Construction Committee that is, and maybe what other committees they're working with?
Yeah, so the Pairing Construction Committee, is working, I'd say, on the front lines of building pairings. So, right now they're working with crew planning to get using the pairing generating software. So it's called pairing, ironically,
Original.
To learn how to use the software. And part of that is we're reaching out to the FSAG committee, the FRMS teams and stuff like that, so we can get the fatigue data that the pilots send us to really try to make better pairings. And the best way to mitigate fatigue is don't build fatiguing pairings. And so one of the goals of the construction committee is to do that, is to begin to look at how we can build less fatiguing pairings. Now, it is quite a task for this committee. They have to learn how to use the software. And so it's a long-term project. It's not going to have an immediate fix, but we're going to play the long game on this and get ourselves involved in building the pairings right from the ground up. So as the scheduling committee, we are part of what's called the SRC, and the SRC is the joint committee that we share with the company. So the scheduling committee is the ALPA committee, and the SRC is the joint committee with the company.
And how's that been going, the relationships with the company right now? Are they fairly amenable to what has gone on with the introduction of the contract? Are they relatively easy to work with, or still some difficulties there?
I'd say it's night and day difference between CA1 and CA2. So I was around during CA1, and to put it bluntly, it was difficult. I mean, if you look at the first 2 years of CA1, it was mostly trying to get us all on the same side of what we were thinking. And we were obviously very far apart. And you could see that in the number of LOUs and MOSs, MOAs that we had. Going into CA2, it's a very different attitude. The company's been much more willing to work with us, to find solutions, and to stick with the timelines that were set out in the CA, which has been phenomenal.
Well, that's positive news and good to hear. So you mentioned that there's a scheduling committee and a scheduling review committee. Could you just break down again what the differences between those two committees are for me?
So the scheduling committee is the ALPA committee, and it includes about 8 members from ALPA, where the scheduling review committee is our ALPA scheduling committee, and then the company affiliates. So there would be people from crew planning, crew scheduling, and then different managers within the company.
Okay, Good to know. Good background information. So overall, you get the impression that the implementation of CA2 is going a bit better than it did with CA1. I think there's probably a few specific sections in CA2 that you might want to touch on. I think it was sections 8, 9, and 10. What are those sections? Let's start out with section number 8 and the specific things that you'd like to highlight about that.
Yeah, so section 8 is really our, the scheduling rules and stuff like that. And when you look into them, what we tried to do there was really clarify some of the language, right? And align us more with the cars, right? So when CA1 came out, there was a change in the cars. We were going from the old rules to what we call CG2, so the new duty time rules. And when CA1 was written, we didn't know the full version of what it would look like. And so there were some rules that we had that just didn't align. And so when you go through the new contract, you'll find that we've clarified things like flight duty period versus duty, which is all changed in the cars. We have different tables and stuff like that now clarify that are more representative of the cars and stuff like that. Other things we did is we aligned our rest periods to better align with the cars and sort of clear up the language on what was expected for, say, a day of or day out operations. We've increased our language around augmentation, around night duty pairings, max duty periods for training, and all sorts of things like that. So those were some of the things that we really focused on in Section 8.
Okay. In Section 8, is there any one particular area that you feel like, hey, this is a real positive or the biggest move forward that you would say in that particular section? In
that particular section, I would say, in the big thing, it's just the clarity of the language, right? To really clarify what all the sections are. We've broken out the tables now, like the flight duty tables. They were a little bit confusing before, so now we have a maximum flight duty period for day of operations, and we have one for planning purposes. And the reason we did that is we recognize that there's a difference between a planning scenario where we're building pairings and then a day of scenario where, operations have different things that are going to happen. You might get delayed and stuff like that. So you're going to notice that from a planning perspective, we wanted to put more restrictions on that. So to mitigate the fatigue issues, especially in those later parts of the day and going into the night. So you'll notice that the differences between that and the cars limit the amount of hours that we can fly at night to really try to capture some of those fatigue issues we have around night duty and red-eye flying and stuff like that.
Yeah, all very important, and I'm sure that our pilots are very happy that those conditions are coming into place now. So a couple times in our conversation, we have brought up cars and the regulations in cars. Just for clarification purposes, are we essentially in our contract just flying cars now, or are those the limits, or are there other limits where our contract differs from cars?
Yeah, so what we did in the contract is we sort of broke out sort of two different definitions. We sort of have what can happen day of, and that follows pretty much the cars. But then we did from a planning perspective, because that's where you want to capture most of your fatigue issues, right? And what we did is we stepped down the hours that, into the later periods of the night and stuff like that, to limit and restrict the company from building like long red eyes or long night duty periods and stuff like that. We also put restrictions into, maximums for how long a red eye could be, how long it could be, and how many legs it could be. So those are restrictions over and above the cars that we were able to negotiate.
Okay.
Now, obviously, they are just contractual limits, and we will continually always work on making schedules better and less fatiguing for the pilots. That's one of the goals of the construction committee, actually.
Naturally. And how does that relate to what other airlines are doing?
So it's pretty common that most airlines in Canada anyways would have, or our main competitor, Canada, would have different rules for day of operations and then somewhat more restrictive rules for planning purposes. So it's a pretty common theme.
Good to know, and good to know we're heading in the right direction. A couple of other things, or things that pertain more to the bidding of our schedules. There's been some enhancements there that are coming into play now. Could you just talk about those?
Yeah, so most pilots, if you bid your schedule, you notice that we got two new bidding options. One is day of the week, and then one is specific pairings. So the day of the week one was a contractual requirement, but the specific pairings was one that we asked as the scheduling committee through the SRC. And so what we were able to do through the SRC, so that's the joint committee between ALPA, scheduling committee, and the company, is to get another option. You know, the company saw the value in that. They wanted to show to the pilot group that the SRC did work. And so they provided with us probably the most requested option, which is to request specific pairings in your bid. So that just came live in December. I tried it out myself for December, and I was really happy to see that I actually got the pairing I bid for.
Okay, well, that's good news.
So I'll add that to that too. So, you know, with the specific pairings, you know, obviously we had to negotiate for the final pairing package. So that's why you'll now see that the preliminary pairings come out on the 6th, that the final pairings come out on the 8th. And I can't stress enough, if you're going to bid specific pairings, make sure you look at the final pairing package. That's where you're going to find the pairing number that you need to bid for. And the nice thing with that option is you can bid for a specific day or a whole range of days. So it's a great option. I think, you know, like myself, sometimes I want to bid a pairing to, hey, we're going back to Dublin now, but I only want to go once. So now I can just add that one pairing on that one weekend or day that I want to go there, instead of saying I want to go to Dublin and then I get 4, which, you know, I don't really want. I just want to go once. So I think it's a great option, and I'm excited that we got that.
So that might lead to some increase in schedule satisfaction. And on that note, is there a place or information where a pilot can look at what their actual schedule satisfaction is, and how does that relate to their next month's bid?
Yeah, so what we did in the contract too is make it a requirement that the company publish your satisfaction. So if you go on to SharePoint now, under where the WestJet Pilots are, I believe it's where the reserve tab is in the reserve portal, you're going to see something called satisfaction score. And it's a spreadsheet where you can put in your employee number and will give you your last month's satisfaction. And so what we wanted for that, or why we wanted it, was to finally educate pilots on what their bid, you know, what those points mean. You know, for the longest time, you would get a wings bid and you would see a points total at the bottom. But that points total never really told you anything. It just said you have 1,000 points or you have a negative 1,000 points. So what we wanted to do is to provide pilots with the score so that they could begin to understand their bid better. And so along with the score, you're going to see the calculation that it calculates satisfaction. So satisfaction is just a mathematical calculation. And really simply, it's your best score that the solver could determine minus your worst score divided by your actual score minus your worst score. So this is how AdOps solver works to determine your satisfaction. And so why would you want to know that? Well, the big reason is, let's say you put in a bid, Des, and you're like, I got the worst schedule ever. But then you go to your satisfaction score and it says, wow, I got 90% satisfied. What that allows you to do then is to go look at your bid and go, okay, I must be bidding something wrong, because if the computer's telling me I'm satisfied, but I don't feel satisfied, then I need to look at what we're doing or what I'm bidding and re-look at what I'm bidding. And so I believe this is the first step in really educating the pilot group on how to bid. So we just got back the ALPA PBS committee. We went down to Washington just recently, where we met up with all other ALPA carriers, and we talked nothing about PBS. And for those who don't know, PBS stands for Preferential Bidding System. And so that's WINGS, right? So we know it as the WINGS interface. Other carriers use different systems, NavBlue, Adopt, Jepson. Those are some of the big ones. So we spent 2 days talking everything PBS. So it's a scheduling, a great time for schedulers like us. And what we really came out of that conference was that education is a huge component of PBS. Because it doesn't matter what type of system you have. It doesn't matter if you have a seniority-based system using NavBlue software or an add-up system using Fair Share. If you don't understand the algorithm, you can't get a good schedule. It doesn't matter if it's a seniority-based or Fair Share system. You have to understand how the computer works. And if you understand that, if you're given the tools, then you can begin to get a better schedule. And so one of the plans we really want to work on is educating the pilots on how the bidding system works, how the PBS system will solve. And one of the first tools we wanted to give to the pilots was, here's your satisfaction score. We also put out recently how the math is calculated. So if you go into the EFB under the ALPA folder, you're going to find a scheduling folder, and in there we've got some great documents, including a satisfaction document that will walk you through how that math works. And then going into the new year, the PBS committee really wants to become the source for pilot advice on bidding. We've relied on crew planning forever, and they've been great, but really you should come to us for bidding advice. We want to be the go-to. And let crew planning, do what they do best, and take some of that weight off their shoulders. And we're going to start to become, the de facto people that you would go to. And so, look for some stuff in the new year where we're going to work with ALPA National on hopefully some educational tools to better educate the pilots on schedules.
So we're looking for our pilots to look for expertise from our pilot experts in given subject matter areas. And in this case, that's you and your committee. All good news. So lots of new information, lots of new things to be learned. And you say that we can look for an education piece coming out for our pilots sometime in 2024?
Yeah. We're going to be working with ALPA National and probably our own internal teams and trying to, just build, more information for the pilots, because I think that's the best thing we can do.
Excellent. Sounds like we're making a good thing better. Okay, so moving on. We've had a good look at Section 8, the scheduling rules, and let's move over now to Section 9, hours of service. What information do you have for us about that?
Yeah, so one of the big changes there are a lot of changes in hours of service. One of the new things that we brought in was the scheduling adjustment window, or the SAW, as we like to call it. So, when you look at a lot of American carriers, you'll see a lot of ways to adjust your schedule. And so we wanted to add that concept into our contract. And, we're probably the first carrier in Canada to introduce something like this. And I'm not going to lie, in Canada, we're probably 10 years behind the Americans when it comes to scheduling rules. They have a lot more, quality of life things in their contract that we're slowly working on. So the scheduling adjustment window, or the SAW, is probably that first step. And so the scheduling adjustment window is created from the residual open time that's left over after you build pairings. So in Section 8, we didn't talk about it, but there's a little section that says the company has to leave out 0.5% to start with, moving up to 1% next year, of all of the block hours. So the reason that you do this is to sort of de-stress your scheduling system. So if I'm a solver in the computer and I don't have to schedule all of the flying, I can then find better solutions, right? So we know that at 0.5%, it's not a big percentage, and moving up to 1% will help, but it's a start. And so with that residual open time that we get from the schedule creation, we then put that open time into the SAW. So the SAW opens 24 hours after the schedules are released, and then it's open for a period of 48 hours. Within that period, you'll see open time come into the next month's schedule. So for instance, if we're running in November, you'll see open time in the December open time pod in Flicka. You can then go in there for this 48 hours and you can swap or pick up a pairing. Now, The intention of the SAW was to give pilots, greater flexibility in their schedule. It's not a great tool if you're looking just to pick up extra flying. If you're looking to pick up extra flying, we suggest that you look to the trade board so you can I could pick up your pairing, Des, or wait till, open time comes up after the SAW.
Just for clarification, pilots hear open time, and they think premium pay. So when that company issued open time goes into the SAW, that's not at premium pay yet, correct?
No, absolutely not. It's at straight time. So if you go into the SAW, you're just picking up straight time. And I want to be very clear that if you adjust, like if you're, say, blocked at 70 hours or something like that, you have a credit for 70 hours, and you make, say, a net swap so that you're up 5 hours. So I take a 20-hour pairing and I swap it for a 25-hour pairing. You're only going to get your MMG of 77.5 hours. Vice versa, though, however, if you had a 25-hour pairing and you dropped down to 20 hours, so you basically essentially lost 5 hours, the 5 hours would be deducted off your 77.5. So, it's a really, one thing we wanted to clarify to pilots is that any additional time that you pick up in the SAW is not added to the MMG. It's just simply added to your current credit for that month. So we want to make that very clear because we have received numerous darts about why didn't I get premium pay or I thought I was getting extra. So the SAW is to adjust your schedule.
Yeah, so if you were at 77 hours at your minimum monthly credit and you picked up a parent, you traded something that added 5 hours to what you had before, bringing you to 82.5 hours, you would get the credit for the 5 hours at your regular rate.
Yeah,
okay.
You would be paid 82.5 hours. Now, if you're at, say, your credit was 83 hours and you had a net gain of 5, you would be paid 88 hours and you would be paid in 2 hours of overtime because you've hit the overtime trigger after 85 hours.
Right. So all the rules and conditions from the contract apply to the addition of those credits.
Yeah, except for the point where when you're adding credit, like if you're picking up the time, like I mentioned, if you're below the block, so if your credit is, say, 70 hours and you add 5 hours, you're only going to be paid 77.5 hours. It's not on top of your MMG. So that's different than, say, a premium pickup or a shift trade, which is on top of your MMG, regardless of your current credit.
Good to know. So we said previously that the amount of pairings that the company is putting into the scheduling adjustment window is about 0.5% of the pairings that are available. So in layman's terms, about how many physical pairings would that equate to?
So yeah, 0.5% is not a lot. It's about 10 to 15 pairings system-wide. Mm-hmm. What we then do, or what crew planning does, is they then usually break those pairings down. So 10 to 15 pairings might turn into 20 to 25 pairings. And we do try to distribute them through most of the bases, but Calgary being the biggest base will have the majority of them. And so the way this SAW works is, Des, if you go in there to swap your pairing that you've swapped now becomes available for me to pick up, then my pairing could be in there for another pilot to pick up. And so it does create a bit of a chain reaction. And so generally we see, those 20 pairings could turn into anything between 50 to 75 different transactions.
Okay. So what happens to a pairing at that, we've gone through several pairings that have been dropped, picked up, and now there's still those residual pairings left in the SAW bucket, as it were. What happens to them when the window closes?
So after the window closes, anything that remains or anything that comes up afterwards then goes into the open time pool to be picked up at premium pay. And so this is another area of the contract that we changed. We went from sort of our call-out order to a very much an industry standard timeline. We did that for numerous reasons. The old call-out order wasn't working very well. And when you begin to look across the industry, you see that everybody's gone to timelines because it gives everybody a sense of when everything will happen, right? So once the SAW closes 48 hours at 9 o'clock Mountain Time, all of the open time then goes in to be picked up at premium pay. And then anything else that comes up, so if you call in sick for a pairing, that will go into the open time pool as well and can be picked up from Flicka. Now, we then kind of march down a timeline until we get to about 10 o'clock the day prior. And at 10 o'clock, any pairing that's left in the open time pool can be assigned to a pilot on long call. Once we hit 4 o'clock in the afternoon the day prior, then any pairing that remains there or any new open time that comes up can be assigned to reserve, or it could be published on Flicka, and that's at the company's discretion. So we have had lots of questions about open time and why we moved or why we wanted to go to using Flicka again. And the reason was to increase transparency and to make it fair. Right? If you think about the old open time system, we had a list that was held by crew scheduling. There was no visibility, no transparency. It was based on block hours. Nobody really knew where you stood. You would list yourself available. Maybe you got called, maybe you didn't. You never really knew. And the problem was it was impossible to audit. There was no transparency there. And the company really controlled the flow of all the open time. So what we wanted to do in CA2 was allow all the open time to get published as soon as possible, right? Therefore, it increases that transparency because you can see everything that comes out. And then moving it all to Flicka allows all the pilots equal opportunity to pick up that pairing. Now, I know and there's some issues with Flicka. We anticipated a huge demand when we turned the system on because, like I said before, when you didn't know what was there, you just either got called or you didn't, right? So when we basically open up Pandora's box and we show the pilots that there's literally thousands and thousands of hours of open time, we knew that there would be this huge demand for the open time pairings. And we have seen that. Open time has gone super fast, super quickly. And it is something we're monitoring and making sure that the contract's being followed and all the agreements within CAE and Flicka are being followed, and we've reached out to carriers that use Flicka, such as JetBlue and Frontier. They've been using Flicka for years for their open time processes. We've also reached out to CAE to really go, what is the long-term solutions for Flicka? So we know that there are some short-term solutions going to be coming in for Flicka. And then there's a medium-term, and then the long-term is there'll be a new software probably sometime in the next 2 years or so.
Okay. So, I get a lot, or I hear a lot from people that it's impossible to get this overtime and somebody must be up to something, and there's rumors of people having bots. What do you have to say about that, or what might you know about that? Are there any potential solutions to that in the future?
So we do know that there's an issue. I think we're monitoring it right now, but I want to let the pilots know too that, so we looked at all the trends. And so if we look back at September, I saw, in Calgary specifically, there was about 230 pilots that picked up about 3,600 hours of open time. When I looked in October, there was about 230 pilots picked up about 4,000 hours of open time. And when I look at this month currently, we're looking at about 200 pilots and about 3,000 hours of open time. So what does that show me? Well, it shows that there's still a really good distribution of open time, going to about the same amount of pilots that there always is. So although Flicka has issues, I do still think that there's still good distribution. And we are working on solutions. And I think that there'll be something coming out in the near future.
So if people were using these bots, there's the potential for an IT solution to minimize that impact going forward. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I would, suggest that anybody using Flicka, make sure that they read the user guides in Flicka and follow the Flicka guidelines. CAE's got some policies there to make sure that all pilots are following them.
Okay, good stuff. So we've looked in Section 9 at the scheduling adjustment window. We've looked at some open time. How about now we talk a bit about reassignment of ACM?
Yeah, so when it comes to ACM, which stands for Assignment Cancellation and Modification, it's very similar to PCM. The name changed just to reflect that you could be assigned a pairing and or a training event. And one of the other changes was that the times changed as well. So you in the old PCM, they had till 5 o'clock to assign you a pairing. Now there's 2 times. So we have 5 o'clock time where they can assign you something that starts prior to 1 o'clock the next day. And then the second time would be 2100 home base time, which would be for a start anything after 1 o'clock the next day. So, we really want to highlight the fact that ACM is not reserve. So if your pairing gets canceled, you're not on reserve, you're on ACM. ACM has no wrap. You're not required to be on your phone or anything like that. You're just supposed to be apprised of any changes in your schedule. So like I said, there's the 2 times. They can assign you something by 5 o'clock for an earlier start. And if you don't get that, then they can assign you something by 2100 for 1300 start the next day.
Okay, good, Sue. So that's 1700 for 1300 or earlier, 2100 for 1300 or later. Is that about right?
That sounds right.
Okay, good. So just to be clear, ACM, assignment cancellation modification, not available crew member, because pilots, we all love our TLAs, right? Glad we've got that all cleared up. TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. So now that's out of the way, let's move to RTD, another TLA. Yes. Return to duty.
So return to duty, one of the things in bargaining that, we're trying to go for is that if you're not a reserve pilot, you shouldn't be placed on reserve. So under the old CA language, if you came back, returned to duty, you were placed on short call reserve. And so we went back and forth a few times and we landed on using a code called RDL, which follows long call reserve. And we were good with that because it provides pilots with a 14-hour window where if you get a notification, the company then has to give you 14 hours to get there, just like long call reserve has that long call out period. So that gives people, like if you're commuting or you live away from your base, it gives anybody calling in fit to fly that extra time to get to their base for a possible assignment.
And on one of our previous podcasts, it was mentioned by one of our MEC members that they want us to use Flicka to notify crew scheduling that we are fit to return to duty, and not use the phone, but use the Flicka system as that tool. It makes things a lot more streamlined and a lot easier.
Yeah, and we, from a scheduling committee perspective, we've always suggested use the automation to identify when you're fit to fly. It's just a way easier process and simplifies it for everybody.
So basically, continue to keep it simple. Use the automation and keep things streamlined. All right, we're making our way through this. We've been through Section 8, scheduling, Section 9, hours of service, and that brings us to Section 10, reserve.
Yeah, so with the reserve, obviously there are some changes to the rules. What I want to tell the pilots too is that, reserve is a seniority-based system. And in any seniority-based system, you have to have an audit process. So every month, the PBS committee audits the reserve bid to make sure that it follows the order of seniority, that the amount of long call reserves are contractually compliant, and that the assignments in general follow the contract. We do that every month, and you should see that in the fast reads. We send out the synopsis to all the pilots to show them the reserve numbers and the amount of long call as well. The other thing I want to talk to reserve pilots about is, a seniority-based system works in a different manner than a fair share. Now, AdOps Solver for seniority still uses the point system. So what we find sometimes is that when pilots bid, I don't think they quite understand how the math works. So just in the same way a fair share system works, Des, where number 1 is 1,000 points, and then it goes down to linear where number 16 is worth 1. A seniority-based system works the same way, but in order of seniority. So I like to think of it as like a ladder. And so it'll work on the top pilot, and it will try to make you the most satisfied using your bids in the same sort of calculation to create the best schedule for you, right? And so it goes down in order of seniority, solving that way. And what we found is that pilots, can get what we deem mathed, right? So that's where, maybe you bid something number 1 at 1,000 points, and then right after that, you bid a bunch of other days off. You end up not getting your first bid because the solver had to make a choice somewhere, and it decided that the bottom 3 bids were, a better point score than the top bid. And so you end up getting your bottom 3. And we see this time and time again. And so what we did is we created a user guide that you can find on the EFB that will walk you through how the seniority system works in AdOps Solve. And I really encourage pilots to read that. We've also got a great Q&A in there that talks about all of the changes in Section 10 and all of the items that you should be familiar with.
Okay, so I hear you're talking about seniority and solver and satisfaction all kind of in the same line. Why can't it just be seniority? Why don't we just get rid of all that stuff and it's just based on seniority? Why doesn't it work that way?
So every single PBS system uses some sort of algorithm to determine pilot schedules. In AdOps world, they use the points that we're all familiar with in the fair share system to build pilot schedules in order of seniority. So they use the points to determine your level of satisfaction by trying to award you the maximum amount of points it possibly can in order of seniority. So it's a little bit different than the fair share system, but it still has the same sort of logic. And every PBS has to have some sort of logic that it uses to determine the schedule. So, when I hear pilots talk about seniority, I think they're thinking about an old school system called line bidding. Line bidding is a totally different system that very few airlines use anymore. That was more of a pure seniority system, and it was literally a line would be built specifically for you. Nobody uses that anymore. Everybody's gone to PBS. And so these systems always work on an algorithm, and this is AdOps algorithm that they use to solve for seniority.
Interesting. Now, I'm curious, where in our contract does it say that we're going to use seniority with satisfaction bidding? It just says seniority.
So this is, in AdOps world, it's solving in order of seniority. So it is a seniority solve. But the way it works or builds your schedule is it just uses the points.
Okay, so John, just to clarify, for reserve bidding and for our reserve bidding system, we use seniority for that. Is that correct?
That's correct. So for pilots on reserve, they're going to bid their days off using a seniority-based system. So we use the same system, the AdOps system, to solve for seniority. So if you're the number 1 senior pilot and you bid a bunch of days off, you're going to have the greatest chance of getting those days off. Now, there are going to be limitations, right? So some of the things in the contract is all your GRDs or GDOs are always awarded in 2-day blocks and or 4-day blocks unless you waive those provisions. And so what we see sometimes is a pilot who will bid, be a senior pilot and bid for reserve and not get their days off because the GDOs, they were required to have 2 GDOs or 4 GDOs. So what we always recommend to pilots on reserve is to, make sure that you understand how the system works. Make sure you read the guide that we've put out. We've got a great guide on how to bid and different material on reserve. But understand that, the solver is going to award in blocks of 2 and 4, or your GDOs in blocks of 2 and 4, unless you waive those provisions.
So are there any other changes to the reserve system that you would like our pilots to know about, John?
Yeah, so I think one of the good changes for pilots on long call now, you have that ability to proactively pick up a pairing and place it in your block. So you can go on to Flicka, and if there's a pairing that you want and it's in your long call block, you can proactively pick it up, and that's you can be awarded it. One of the other changes is the call out time for long call is now longer. It's 14 hours. When we move to short call, there's a few little changes that are, sometimes get a little bit missed, I would say, when pilots look at it. So we moved away from we used to have 2 blocks of reserve. We now have an AM block and a PM block. So if you're on SCA, your block could start at 4, it could start at 5 or 6, right? If you're on a PM block, it could start at anywhere between 12 till 1959. All blocks of reserve or all wraps are still 12 hours. So that's the big thing to know. So that hasn't changed at all. But it's just to let pilots know that, your wrap isn't from 4 till 11:59 if you're on AM. It's just the wrap can start from 4 till 11:59 if you're on AM. So it's just some clarification there.
Okay, John, so just to clarify a couple of things, as I mentioned before, as pilots, we love those TLA 3-letter acronyms. One of those is the wrap. Could you just touch on what that is again for us, please?
Yeah, so the wrap, is the reserve availability period. So that's the time that you're on call for the company while on reserve.
Perfect. And the other thing that I just wanted to look at was we mentioned the long call proactive pickup. Are you saying that if there's anything on the trade board or an open time that I could pick it up, or are there some specific restrictions on it?
Yeah, you're only allowed to pick up open time. And there are some restrictions to the days that you can pick up, and you can read more in Section 10.
Good news, good information. So now, is there anything else about reserve that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, so we have a new reserve website that reserve pilots can use. It's got a lot more usable information for them, and this is probably, I would say, phase 1, and we hope to see a better version. But it'll provide you a lot more information than the old one.
Okay, like what is new in the phase 1 as opposed to the old?
So you're going to see all of the pilots that are on reserve. It'll rank them in order of seniority. It'll show the base they're in, the wrap they're on, or if they're on SCA or B, and the amount of days they have in the wrap. So it allows you to see who you can pass to, or who you could potentially pass pairing to, and the other pilots on reserve.
Yeah, it takes that out of the dark a bit. I know a lot of guys have called in and said, well, I'd like to pass. Like, there's nobody to pass to, and they've had no way to look or confirm that. This will certainly shed some light on that. Is there anything else new coming down the pipe that we might be looking for?
Yeah, so we have a few other things. We have LOU 16, which we're going to start working on relatively quickly. That's the one where we're going to go out and put an RFI, so that's a request for information for new bidding software and new pairing generation software. So again, the pairing software is what we use to construct pairings. PBS is what we use to bid our schedules. We haven't done this in years, so we just want to go out to the market and see, what else is out there, and even ask ADOP what's the future of their products.
I can't lie. When I hear you mention new software for pairing generation, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside because, it's one thing to be able to bid for something, but if what you're bidding on is garbage, that doesn't really help. And pairing generation software is going to make a significant difference in that. Lots of new information here, lots of good information here from our resident subject matter expert on scheduling, John Jaenicke. Thank you very much for that. Hey, what's a good way to get information out to you, or questions? If people have questions, what do you think the best way is to get them to you and your committee?
We love darts. It's a great way for you to get a hold of us. If you have a question, feel free to send us a dart. It's the best way to get a hold of us.
John, a heartfelt thank you for coming in today. Scheduling is a big deal for our pilots. It affects all of us. and is always great to hear from our subject matter expert on that. And I'm sure this will not be the last time that we hear from you. As John mentioned, they love the DART, so if you have questions that you would like to get answered, file a DART. There's also plenty of information available on the EFB, and he wants to hear from you. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure that all of your questions are answered and that our pilots are all very well informed. So until the next time, I'd like to say thanks for everybody for tuning in. Wear your lanyards, stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay safe. Thanks again for listening to this edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilots podcast.